My plan for this is to hopefully have it be a conversation, allow plenty of time for back and forth, people asking questions, chiming in. So please go ahead and put your comments and questions in the Discord server, and the NASFiC staffers will copy them over to me, and I will try to answer them. And we'll try and make this as conversational as possible. I don't know necessarily what brought people to this panel. So maybe you are here because you're interested in starting a magazine, or maybe you're interested in running a convention, or maybe creating an arts foundation. And I'm going to be trying to talk a little bit about all of that through my history in the field, and some of where things went well, maybe some of where things went poorly. And hopefully it'll be of use. So I'm going to jump back many years now to about 20 plus years, must have been like 24 years. When I was just out of college, I was writing erotica in the kind of dawn of the internet, and putting these stories online, and there were not a lot of forums for this material, right? There had been a couple of magazines started. One of them was Nerve, another one was Scarlet Letters, and some of us got together and said, you know, neither of these really have the vibe that we want. We want kind of a clean, well-lighted place for smut, was essentially our short note, our short version of this. And Lisa sent a side note to me. I assume you know Cecilia Tan, and I will just shout out here that Cecilia Tan published my first story ever at her Circlet Press, which does erotic science fiction and fantasy. Cecilia is awesome. So we started this magazine. We decided to call it Clean Sheets, and we wanted it to be like, here's a place that like a housewife from the Midwest would be comfortable to come and read something delightful and smutty. And it was definitely wanting to have a different attitude than someplace like Nerve, which was all about being kind of New York and edgy. So one thing, if anyone listening is like starting a venture, you want to be able to articulate, you know, what is it that you want to do? How is it different from everything else that's out there already? And I think of it as like, where is there a hole in the field that could use filling, that could use where there's a need that needs to be filled? And that will, if you have that, that's going to make it a lot easier for you to get volunteers, to get fundraising, all of those things. If you can explain to people concisely, like you need the same kind of elevator pitch for this that you would need if you were selling your novel. You want to be able to explain to people concisely, like, this is why it's important that this thing exists. Okay, so I started Clean Sheets, and at the time, this was, as I said, early days of the internet. We didn't know anything about how we were going to fund the magazine. We wanted to pay the writers, and we wanted to pay them SIFWA Pro rates. At the time, I think that was 3 cents a word. So we decided we were going to fundraise, I think, for the first issue, and then look for advertising money once we were up and running. I would not recommend this approach now. Back then it worked for a while because it was the dawn of the internet and a lot of companies were throwing money around. So you could actually get a fair bit of ad money back then. That mostly went away. And then they had to look for other ways to fund the magazine going forward. I ran it for 2 years. We put it out as a weekly magazine, and I had a staff of about 30 volunteers. Everyone on staff was a volunteer. I originally organized it as a collective. The plan was, yes, we're all gonna, make decisions together. All of this was being done via email back in those days because there wasn't really much else. We lived all over the world, and we were able to do this work via email, which was great. But the problem was that very quickly we discovered that running things as a collective is very time consuming. It's really slow to get 30 people to make a decision and to come to consensus on this. And so we tried, I think, for a while, well, we're only going to vote together on like really big decisions, and otherwise everyone will be in their little 3 people in the fiction department, 3 people in poetry, etc. But eventually we kind of got to a point of this is just not working. And really, I got to a point where I was finding it too frustrating to try and run the magazine that way. So I gathered all the volunteers together via email and said, folks, I'm really sorry, but this is not working for me, and I need this to be a hierarchy. And if that doesn't work for you, sorry, but thank you for everything you've done so far, but this is going to be the new form. So I was a little dictatory in that way. That may not, that may not be everyone's approach. But what we ended up doing was, I was editor-in-chief. I had someone directly below me who was the managing editor, I think was the title we came up with. And then everyone else was in their departments, and they had autonomy within the department. So as long as the fiction editors were putting together the material every week, getting a story to the webmasters on time that was, well edited and in good shape, I didn't interfere with that. And the same thing with poetry and art and so on. So this is another aspect of running these organizations to think about, is what kind of management and structure do you want for the org? And and there are definitely some conversations worth having about sort of the value of a collective and a communal organization in terms of equal power distribution versus the kind of efficiency of hierarchies. Hierarchies are efficient. If anyone listening is an Octavia Butler fan, she sees hierarchies, she saw them as kind of like the fundamental flaw of humanity and what was going to lead us to destruction. So I always kind of have her in mind as a little bit of a check. And I'm always, even in my hierarchical organizations, I'm actually always looking to see where can I give people, where can I make it possible for people to be empowered, to take ownership of their areas, to have autonomy, to have opportunity to advance and do something that's more managerial if that's what interests them. And yeah, and some people don't want that. Some people are like, I just want to pick poetry, and that's my jam, and I'm happy doing that. Or I just want to run the website and be sure you guys have a clean website, and I'm super grateful to all of my volunteer webmasters over the years who took care of the tech for us. So yeah, that's a conversation. If you're getting together with a bunch of friends to put on a con or whatever else, it's, I think, good to have a conversation about how you're going to structure it. Yes. So I still am not sure if there's I'm not used to running this kind of thing with me talking to an unknown number of people. I'm finding it a little disconcerting. So before I go on to talk about Strange Horizons, I'd love to, I'm just going to ask people to drop into the Discord chat a little bit about like what specific area of all this interests you. Like, are you interested in a magazine or a con or anything else? And it'll help me guide and focus my conversation going forward. So, okay. So we had this staff, and I guess I should run through what our breakdown was. We had 3 people on fiction, 3 on poetry, 3 on art, 3 on articles, 3 on reviews. That's 15. Me, the other managing editor, is 17. We had a proofreading copy editing team of 3 people. So that's 18, 19, 20. And then we had a couple volunteer PR people, and I think that's it. We did not break out fundraising or bookkeeping. Basically, I handle those things. And which I wouldn't necessarily recommend. and I think that was most of who we had for the first magazine. So about 25 people. Now, I would love to be able to show you the magazine, but I can't. And that points to one of the sadnesses of passing this kind of thing on, which is, I'm going to try and screen share. So hopefully you guys are all seeing an Amazon page right now that says "From Porn to Poetry, Clean Sheets Celebrates the Erotic Mind." Because I'm a entrepreneurial type person, I like starting things. I'm not great at maintaining them. I have ADHD. I'm easily distracted, bright, shiny. So I'm not the person who you want maintaining something long term. I am great for getting it up and running and being the person with the vision who talks a whole bunch of people into coming and volunteering for this thing. That's the piece of it that I'm useful for. And after about 2 years, historically, I'm done and ready to move on to the next project. So I ran Clean Sheets for 2 years and then promoted Susanna Indigo, who had been my managing editor, agreed to take it over and became editor-in-chief. And I walked away from the magazine, and they kept it going for a long time. They kept it going for something like 15 years, publishing weekly, increasing pay rates. And then at some point, they disappeared. The magazine went down. Susanna disappeared off the internet. I haven't been able to track her down since. All the archives, we had been archiving everything, they all went away. And it honestly, it's super sad and frustrating. So this is another element of that you should think about is if you're not staying with your baby and baby's growing up, do you care about putting in processes to be sure that should the people you hand it off to start messing it up in some way or abandon it, you can take it back and, take it over again or find new people, etc. In retrospect, I wish that I had not had such a clean cut and that I had stayed in touch with Susanna and kind of been on an ongoing board or something like that so that it wouldn't just disappear overnight. So that was Clean Sheets. Maybe someday the Wayback Machine or something will be able to pull it back. They did many issues. They put out books, and there it was. So jumping forward, and oh yeah, and I am going to totally talk about why nonprofit in just a moment. So we organized Clean Sheets as a nonprofit and then Strange Horizons later as a nonprofit specifically to make it easier to fundraise. Okay, you're going to have to think about where the money comes from, and you can charge the public for it. You can, but we were pretty committed to, we wanted to make the magazine free to read. We didn't want to put it behind a paywall. You can use Kickstarters. These days you can use Kickstarters and so on to fundraise in advance. So that's totally a decent approach if that's going to work for your level of funding. But if you're trying to build something that has the potential to grow and go on for many years, you may want to be able to set up ongoing support for it beyond what you can do with a Kickstarter. And so in that situation, if you're a nonprofit, donations to you are tax deductible, right? And it's not just individual donations, it's also things like if somebody works for a company that does matching grants, they can apply to their company for a matching grant. And let's say they donate $500, but they work at Apple and Apple matches it for another $500. Now you've got a bunch more money. So jumping forward a little, the next magazine I started was in 2000. We launched Strange Horizons. So we are actually right at our 20-year anniversary now. And just in case anyone hasn't seen it, I'll share the screen. You can see the current issue of Strange Horizons. It's a weekly magazine, science fiction and fantasy. All the archives are thankfully still there, the last 20 years of material. You can donate on the site. Here's info on submitting, etc. Right? And going to stop the share screen right now. Strange Horizons started, it came out of a convention at, it came out of a Worldcon actually, because I had gone to a Campbell panel. The Campbell Award is given to people who are new to the, who are like they're nominated for the best new writer of the year, right? And so this panel was all these young hotshot writers, not all young, but new hotshot writers. And they were talking, and one of them said he had counted, and he'd counted how many slots there were for new writers in the magazines in the past year, and there had only been something like 25 slots. All of the others had been taken by established writers. And I heard him say that, and I thought, wow, that is a huge, yes, the Campbell is now the Astounding Award for Best New Writer. Thanks, Lisa. So, and I think it's a good change. So it seemed like having only 25 slots was a artificial bottleneck in the field that was blocking the potential for a lot of new writers to come in as pros, right? These are for the pro slots, and you need 3 pro sales to be an active member of SFWA, the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers Association. So it seemed like the easy way to address this was to create a magazine and create a whole bunch more pro slots. And if we did it as a nonprofit, that would kind of explicitly signal, like, we're not, we don't want to be beholden to newsstand sales, to subscription sales. We wanted to, I used to talk about it as the museum model, right? Like, we want this to be free to the public. We want to be able to showcase the best material that comes in and not be stuck with putting, you know, the big name on the cover or the dragon on the cover, because, you know, I once heard Shauna McCarthy talking about Realms of Fantasy and saying she tried to buy a story with a dragon in it for every issue, because every time she put a dragon illustration on the cover, newsstand sales jumped like 25%, right? So by making it a nonprofit, that freed us a little bit from the commercial aspect of it. We still needed to, you know, make our money in order to pay our writers, but yeah, it sort of, it changes the framework, I think, and it makes it a little bit easier for you to say, like, you know, we have a different goal here. Our goal here is not just the, like, continued survival of the magazine and paying all of our staff. So, and I was taking my cue a little bit from Ms. Magazine, which at one point decided to stop carrying advertising because they felt that it was compromising their editorial integrity. And they did a direct outreach to their subscribers and readership and said, you know, we think this is compromising us. We are going to stop carrying ads. Please support us if you want the magazine to continue. So, you know, as you're thinking about how you fund things, I feel like these are all sort of elements to have in mind. Now, I want to highlight that we were very committed to paying the writers and paying them pro rates, right? That was obviously why we had gotten into this. We did not think about paying our staff. And as a result, a couple things happened. One is that we got a lot of pushback from the print magazines at the time saying, you know, editors like, you know, the editor of Asimov's and the editor of Analog, et cetera, so on, who I would see at panels at conventions saying, you know, almost saying we were scabs, right? Because we were putting out this magazine sort of being competition, and because we had all volunteer staff, we didn't have the same costs that they did. We also were only doing it online, so we didn't have the print costs that they did. And we were free to the public, so to read. And so we were sort of putting out this very attractive product without and relying on volunteer labor to make it happen. At the time, I would have said, you know, tough. I think that is sort of essentially what I said. Like, well, if volunteers want to do this work, why shouldn't they? And I would say my thinking has changed a little bit on that. And in retrospect, I sort of wish that before I left Strange Horizons, I had started shifting over a little bit of the budgeting and the funding to give the editors and the whole team a little bit of money, right? And odds are, you know, we would not have gotten to anything close to a fair salary, right? You know, my fiction editors put in so many hours back then. Jed Hartman, Susan Groppe, Karen Meisner, you know, they met every week. They read all these stories. They didn't have slush readers for like a decade, and they just volunteered an incredible amount of time. And it would have, you know, broken us financially to pay them a fair market rate for it, right? So this is another thing to think about with your org is how much volunteer labor are you going to rely on? And are you okay with the fact that, you know, I generally think labor should be paid for, right? And in terms of sort of class politics, right? I'm an advocate of the fight for 15. I think people should be paid a living wage. But the arts and nonprofits historically have been a little fuzzy about this because there is often a need beyond what the market can support, right, in terms of fair pay. And so you kind of have to make decisions about, you know, here is my charity organization that is providing, you know, food to the hungry, and we can afford to have 2 paid staff members, and then we rely on 500 volunteers to make it happen. And you just have to figure out where are you in this whole realm of like, what are you okay with and what seems right to you? And I think there are ongoing conversations to be had, right? And science fiction is interesting because we have this incredible tradition of fan-run conventions, right? Just amazing. There is nothing like it in mystery and romance, in certainly in lit fiction. There's nothing on the scale of what we have in science fiction and fantasy. All of these people pouring in time and expertise and energy into making these fabulous cons happen. And it's a tremendous resource. And one of the tensions about talking about labor is, you know, well, what happens if you're like, well, it would really be great if we could pay a bookkeeper because nobody wants to do that job. We haven't been able to find a volunteer who wants to do what is frankly kind of tedious work, unless you are really a finance person who loves it. But those people, I will tell you, are hard to find. You know, is it okay that we pay for this if everybody else is a volunteer, right? And those can be awkward conversations to have and awkward places to stand. But I do kind of think you need to think about it, especially if your organization grows and you are getting, and you want it to be able to grow. A lot of these cons that used to be, you know, sort of geographically limited to being fairly small, now that they are adding virtual components, have a lot of potential to grow tremendously, you know, with a worldwide audience. And you have to think about, well, how do we sustain that growth? What do we need to make it sustainable? Do we need twice as many volunteers as we had last year? Do we need to pay someone to be our volunteer coordinator? Or if we can't find someone to do that, do we need to pay someone to do fundraising? Because that's another thing that's hard to get a volunteer to do. If you know, if your organization relies on a chunk of its funding coming from donors, you know, who is running your Kickstarter campaigns, or who is maintaining your membership database, who's sending out your newsletter and keeping in touch with your donors, letting them know all the great things you're doing, etc. And I'm not saying you can't do that with volunteers, because people have and people do. But it also honestly often tends to burn out volunteers. You have this one dedicated person who's been doing it for years, and then they have a family crisis or, whatever other thing, they move out of state, whatever it might be, and suddenly you're left in a difficult position. I would say, a lot of sci-fi convention people that I've talked to, one of the big challenges that they tell me about is the succession planning is really like it's not so much of a thing that the field has evolved a conversation around. And sometimes your local community is robust enough that there's plenty of new people coming in ready to take up the torch, but sometimes not. And then you can end up in a difficult position. And I've seen WisCon had some real challenges with that. FogCon has been struggling with that. Those are two of the cons that I go to regularly and that I'm really fond of, and I want to see them succeed. And so I've been talking to the people running it, and it's not easy. And WisCon's been running for, I don't know, more than 30 years, I think, right? So they've passed the torch more than once at this point. But it's tricky, and you want to know that when you pass it on, the people you pass it to are also committed to the same need that you saw way back at the beginning, right? The reason why you started this thing. Maybe they're going to manifest it in a different way. So I ran Strange Horizons for 2 years, and then I passed it off to Susan Groppe, who stepped up as editor-in-chief, and then she passed it off to Neil Harrison, and then he passed it off to more people and more people and more people. So and we set it up the same way as Clean Sheets with 30 volunteers, and the entire team has completely turned over since we started it 20 years ago. There's nobody still on staff who was with us at the beginning. And I think it's one of the big success stories in that regard, because I think the magazine still has held very true to its original vision. It continues to publish more new writers at the pro level than anybody else. It has brought a ton of new voices into the field, often very diverse voices, which were a lot of our goals. And it keeps evolving. I mean, the current design and layout is nothing like what we had at the beginning. And it's much more mobile friendly than anything I designed. And all the new people bring their own strengths and their perspectives to the magazine, right? So, okay, I'm gonna show you briefly one more magazine. So, and then I'm gonna switch to talking about something else. Just so you can see what, let's see, there it is. So after Strange Horizons, after I passed it off, I did a couple of things. One of them is I created 2 arts foundations, Desi Lit, which is for South Asian literature, and the SLF, which is for science fiction and fantasy. And I'll talk about the SLF more in a minute. Desi Lit was interesting because we were at this moment where there were a lot of barriers to South Asians trying to get published in America. We often found that publishers just wanted the arranged marriage story and nothing else. So there was frustration. And so we created this organization, a nonprofit arts organization, to support the and there's actually, I don't know if I can show you. Yeah, desilit.org is the overarching organization, and that tells you it's a nonprofit arts foundation, builds support for South Asian and diasporic writing. And we did a bunch of things. We put on a South Asian Lit Festival. We had local chapters, and there was a while at the height of the organization where we had chapters in Los Angeles, Bay Area, Chicago, New York, Toronto, London, a couple more. And they were active chapters. People had workshops. They did reading series. The Toronto chapter put on their own Lit Festival. It was really exciting for a little while. And then the need actually changed, right? It got easier to publish things that were not just the arranged marriage story, and they're just yeah, there wasn't as much of a need for it as there had been. And so some of the chapters just sort of quietly went away. The Chicago chapter is still around. They have a book club that's been going monthly for over a decade. And we still put out a lit magazine, Jaggery. So, which is not nearly as frequent as Strange Horizons. This is 2 or 3 times a year this magazine comes out. So it's more in the mode of the little magazines from literary fiction, right? Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share. And I ran Jaggery also for 2 years and then handed it off to somebody else. So I'm going to answer this chat question. Hafida asks, unpaid labor is so tricky because it has to do with sustainability, and who can afford to commit so much time? Wondering what your thoughts are on that. Yeah, so that's, that is, I want to kind of like highlight that the people who tend to have a lot of free time tend to be more privileged, right? And so in a variety of ways, if you're working 2 jobs, you probably don't have a lot of time to volunteer for one of these organizations, right? And on the one hand, you can sort of say, well, we take whatever volunteers we can get, but it means that often what your organization ends up looking like is often wealthier than the surrounding population, whiter than the surrounding population, etc. Right? And so an example from where I am right now, a couple of years ago, I ran for a local office and I was elected to the library board. And we don't pay a stipend. In the state of Illinois, we are not allowed to give an honorarium to board trustees by state law for the libraries. And I'm guessing that was put in with sort of some intention of, well, that means that whoever serves will be, unbiased by money. They'll be fair-minded. But a consequence of that is that the only people who run for office are the people who can afford the time to run for office, right? Who don't need that time to work a second job, for example. And, there's very little we can do to fix that. We reimburse for travel expenses, we reimburse for childcare. But basically, if you're a single mom with 2 kids, you probably can't run for office on the library board in Illinois, right? You probably can't afford the time. And that's a shame because it means that woman's voice is not going to be represented on the board, and we probably should have some people like her on the board. So, I guess it's worth periodically looking at the composition of your volunteers and saying, all right, are we happy with who we have as volunteers? Are they representative of the community we're trying to build here? If not, what barriers are preventing people from volunteering their time and getting to have a voice in what this end result looks like? Can we do anything to lower those barriers? And, sometimes this can be addressed by just getting a lot more volunteers, right? And so nobody has to put in massive amounts of time. And I think, you've seen that evolution with the magazines. These days, the fiction editors at Strange Horizons have this long set of first readers who are slush readers who look at the submissions as they come in, and that dramatically reduces the workload for the 3 main editors, right? So if you're feeling like, okay, my finance people are super overwhelmed, they're barely keeping up with everything, maybe the thing to do is make it a priority. We need to bring in 3 more people to be helpers on finance, right? And that's the next thing we do. Of course, when you bring in more people, you better have a robust way to communicate with them. And so I hope we get to this. I'm trying to like say everything within the time. One of the current struggles for me is that, 20 years ago, it was relatively easy to do all this via email because we didn't get that much email, and that became less and less feasible. So these days, we've tried a lot of different things, and I mostly use Slack or Discord at this point for project management. And those have helped a lot with providing an organizational system that lets me communicate with, set up teams, have the teams talking to each other, etc. It's still challenging. And I think of like the cell model, right? Of, let's say you've got 3 people, right? One of those 3 people reports back to the larger group. And then if you do that with everybody, with all of your areas, then you're not trying to have everybody talk at once about an issue. You're just kind of like pulling in the people who need to be in that conversation while still trying to represent all the voices. Okay. So I want to get to the SLF, so I'm gonna jump to that right now, and then again, like if you have questions, just please keep posting them, or commentary. So the I'm checking to make sure whether I answered all of the questions. Yeah, and I'll just note, Nyla asked, I'm interested as a writer how I can support nonprofit lit orgs without giving up what tiny amount of money I make. So one of the biggest problems I think all of these groups have is publicity. And so one thing we're working on with the SLF is putting together like, a publicity core, the publicity paladins. We haven't come up with a good name for it, but I think it's a perennial problem. You're doing great work, but nobody knows about it because you have not put time and energy or money into publicizing it. And I would say that's been historically true for everything I've done has been under-publicized and under-documented. So sometimes what you need to do is slow everything down a little bit and be like, okay, we want to put out a magazine every week. What if we put out a magazine every other week? We now have saved half of our budget. And with that money, some of it we're going to put towards actually spending money on advertising and letting people know that the magazine exists, right? And I think that's an important conversation to have. I suspect conventions, I know when I was trying to publicize my little mini-con, it was really difficult back then to get the word out. And there's some people who are really good at hanging out on Twitter and talking things up, or hanging out on Facebook and talking things up. So if you are someone who wants to support one of your local orgs, that's an incredibly useful thing you can do to help. And of course you can volunteer. So it definitely does not have to be just cash. So the SLF, I was going to tell you just a little bit about them. Let me screen share and show that. This is the main thing I do these days. It's not my day job. My day job is I'm a professor, and that actually is what pays the rent. The SLF, for the most part, I've been doing it for about 20 years as a volunteer. It is a nonprofit for the field. The main thing we've been doing is giving grants to writers. So we have an older writers grant, diversity grants, travel grant, working class grant. The AC Bose grant is a South Asian grant specifically that was a memorial grant. Someone gave the funds in honor of her father. And we have volunteer jurors who read submissions that come in. It's free to submit. You don't have to pay an entry fee. And then they choose what they think is the work of essentially the best literary quality, and we try and give them $1,000 grant. So we used to do smaller grants. We used to do $250 grants and then $500 grants. but someone at one point kind of made the argument to me that even our kind of low level, like we don't ask a lot for our grant application. It's like a writing sample and whatever, but it's still time, right? And if you're a writer, even if it only takes you an hour to apply for our grant, you know, odds are you won't get it because a bunch of people are applying. If you're applying to 50 grants, well, that's now 50 hours of your time. You want the return on that time to be worthwhile. So we decided to offer fewer grants and make our minimum at least $1,000. So that's, anyway, that's a little bit of like thinking that went into that. Another thing that we do, there's some things that are in development. We do fiscal sponsorships. So because we are a 501c3 organization, donations to us are tax deductible. If you start a small nonprofit, just incorporating as a nonprofit is not enough to be tax deductible. You need to apply for 501c3 status. And so in that, and sometimes that takes a while. It's gotten faster. It used to take quite a long time, and I gathered that they've sped the process up, which is great. But sorry, what was I saying? In that intervening time, we can serve as a way for people to donate to a nonprofit and get a tax deduction. So anyway, there's more information about that on this site. We take a percentage. We take a 5%, which is pretty low. 7 to 15% is standard. And that's mostly enough to like cover the time of our bookkeepers to deal with it, essentially. So yeah, so and like we were fiscal sponsors for FogCon, we were fiscal sponsors for the Odyssey Writing Workshop, a bunch of other organizations, Fiacon, I think, right now. And it's just to help, it helps them get up and off the ground, right? We're starting local chapters. Chicago and the Bay Area just started. We have a bunch of new things that we're working on now. The Portland Project is an open source creative writing resource, kind of like Khan Academy for fiction. And for that, we're doing things like interviewing masters of the field as well as emerging writers, and we're planning to kind of turn these into teaching modules with assignments and reading lists and so on, so that to make it easier both for writers who want to sort of advance their craft on their own, but also for teachers who are looking for resources for their classrooms. We're going to hopefully provide a lot of free stuff that they can make good use of going forward. We have a reading series in Chicago. That's a great reading series that is somewhat on hiatus at the moment. We may go virtual this fall. We'll see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I should say about this. We're hoping to open a physical makerspace in the Chicagoland area. So we were supposed to open that this past June and decided to not do it because of COVID. So we'll see when that actually happens. Okay, I'm going to turn off the share screen because partly when I have share screen, I can't see the chat, so I can't see if there are any questions. Okay, so fiscal sponsors. Lisa asks if we have input on those organizations, or do you just act as a pass-through? We just act as a pass-through. I would say I only agree to do it for orgs that I believe in, but I don't take any responsibility for what they do. Yeah, like, we have an initial conversation, and if it seems like they want to do a good thing, we're like, yes, we will be your fiscal sponsor. There is something that we recently hired, both a bookkeeper and an accountant, which is a huge relief to me because I was doing that for 20 years, but I hated it and I was not great at it. And my bookkeeper is now like generating spreadsheets and pretty charts that make it much easier to see what's going on. So we have, a few part-time staff who get paid an hourly rate of $25 an hour now. And that we started that, the SLF started in 2004. So it was like 15 years in before we started paying anybody. I wish we'd done it sooner. It would have let us do a lot more earlier. So I'll note that in terms of if you do decide to incorporate as a nonprofit, as long as you stay under 50,000 a year, the reporting requirements to the IRS are very minimal. If you go over that, they become more substantial in terms of what you need to do. So we have not crossed that barrier. My understanding from our accountant is that the pass-through funds don't count towards that. So, you know, we could pass through $500,000 and it wouldn't knock us into that next reporting level. Okay, I'm almost out of time. I have 4 minutes left. I'm trying to think if there's anything that I did not cover that I meant to cover. I think, yeah, I'm sort of running through the Discord right now to see. Yeah, Jennifer said trying to schedule a meeting with just the 6 people on my Concom is hard enough. You got to use the tools. I have to say, like, the tools that we have now do make things a lot easier. So and now I'm going to forget the name of whatever the thing is, but you know, there's that thing that lets you send out a calendar and people can block off what times they can or cannot make meetings. That is much more efficient than sending a whole bunch of emails back and forth to try and figure that out. Again, using I have a small press now, Serendip Press, and using Slack for that. Here, I'll screen share one last time. See if I can find I'll just say desktop. And screen share. Slack makes it just way easier to manage my team. And sorry, it took me a little while to do this. So here is the Serendip Press, and you can see we have like a channel for financial, which is locked so that only the finance people can see it. We have general for the press. There's a magazine we're working on. This is the podcast we're working on, and it lets you have asynchronous but organized conversations in, you know, relevant topics. Here's the newsletter. You can tag people. So this was my one of my part-time employees is editing videos for me for my cookbook, so for the small press. And so he tagged me into this, and I have notifications set up so that pops up on my computer, so I can answer him right away. And it used to be that we would do a lot in Facebook Messenger, and this has actually been really helpful for separating out the work stuff from the rest of my life, and for the rest of my team too. Like once we moved to Slack, which we did in March or so, it made everything easier for everyone. And then you can direct message people as well. Discord, some of you are familiar with, works very similarly. I guess you're all using Discord right now. So Discord is sort of more used in the gaming community, and Slack is more used in the business community in my experience. So, all right. Okay, 2-minute warning. I think I'm mostly through the things I wanted to say. I hope this was helpful. Doodle is the thing for schedules. Yes, figuring out people's schedule. It helps. Trello can be useful, is another task list organization tool. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we find particularly helpful. Shared Google Calendars, potentially, depending on, certainly in my own family, we use that a lot, and we also have one for the press. So everyone sees the things that pop up there. And it makes it easier for my husband to see that, you know, oh, Marianne has a press meeting from 2 to 5, and I should not expect her to be able to handle getting dinner ready that day. So Google Calendars, very useful. I think that's it. Any last questions, thoughts? I don't know if Lisa or Jennifer, who have run things as well, want to jump in with anything else at this point. If not, I feel like I should get, you know, bonus points for timeliness because it's 3:50 and I'm done. So thank you all. And I will be on other panels later, and hope to see some of you there. And if you have further questions, feel free. I'll go over to the Discord now, and I can hang out there for about 10 minutes, and feel free to ask me more questions in the Discord. So thanks. Bye.